In the last section, we added our client ID and our client secret to the keys.js file. Now, when we did that, you'll notice that I added on the name Google to both the client ID and the client secret. Just in case you're curious why I did that, let's imagine for a second that we are also going to set up Facebook OAuth inside of our application as well. And so maybe we would want to add on a client ID for the Facebook OAuth to this file as well. If we had just called this thing simply client ID, and then we came back in and we said all of a sudden we have a client ID for Facebook, well, which client ID is which one, right? And so just because I expect to have many different keys inside this file over time, I decided to just put the name Google in front of it to identify the key and make its purpose really obvious. The other thing that I want to point out to you, and make sure that you really triple check this inside of your own keys.js file, notice that I used a capital D for the client ID right here. So capital D, very important. Do not do a lowercase. Okay, so now that we've got our keys inside of this file, we're going to import this file into our index.js file and then pass those keys to the Google strategy so that the Google strategy can properly identify our application to the Google OAuth API. So underneath the Google strategy require statement, I'm going to add in const keys is require, and I'm going to pass in the path to the keys.js file, which is /, so in the current directory, go to the config folder, and then get the keys.js file. Now, for any file that we write that ends in JS, we don't have to add the file extension on there, so we can simply say keys, like so. Okay, so now we've got the keys object. So this is now the object that has the Google Client ID and the Google Client secret. We can pass those two keys to the Google strategy. So as the first argument to the Google strategy, I'm going to add an empty object. I'm going to give it a key of client ID. And do notice, please triple check on your own code base. Make sure you've got a capital D over here as well. And then to this, we'll assign keys.Google Client ID. And again, for the last time, make sure you've got a capital D over here as well. And then we'll get our client secret, which is going to come from keys.Google Client Secret. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now the options object right here requires one other very important argument, or option, excuse me. But before we add that in, I want to talk a little bit about its purpose. So let's talk about this last option that we're going to add into this object, and then we'll come back here and actually add it in. So I'm going to go back over to my browser where we still have our OAuth flow diagram open. Now, remember how this flow is working. When the user clicks on the login screen, the user is going to come to our Express server on the route auth/Google. Now, we have not yet set up that route, but we will very shortly. Whenever a user comes to that route, we are going to automatically forward the request on to Google servers. So that will be a URL of something like, not exactly this, but something like google.com/auth. Once the user is there, they will be prompted to grant permissions to our application. After the user grants permissions, the user will then be redirected back over to our server with that code inside the URL. And remember, that code inside the query string is the real piece of magic. It's what allows our server to do a follow-up request back over to Google and say, hey, we want some details about this user, and here's the code you just gave them. Now, the kind of tricky part here is after the user grants permissions to our application, what actually happens to the user? We had said that they get redirected back over to our server, but what address or what route do they get redirected to? And so we have to manually specify where we want the user to be sent to. So in this diagram, I had said that after the user grants permissions, we want to automatically get the user sent back to our server on the route of auth/Google/callback. And so presumably we'll have some route handler here or some logic to say whenever a user comes to this route, we want to then take the code out of the URL and do this like follow-up request over to Google servers. So the third option that we're going to pass into that options object is this route right here, auth/Google/callback. So it is the route that the user is going to be sent to after they grant permission to our application. Now, this might seem like a very fine-grained detail, and yeah, it definitely is, right? Remember, one of the things that I said was kind of rough about Passport is that you have to kind of nudge it along or give it these little very small configuration pieces, and it can be kind of tough to figure out how this stuff is all flowing and working together. And so this is a great example of that. I'm saying we have to provide this little URL or this little route right here of where the user should be sent to after they grant permissions. But if you didn't really see this diagram right here, you might say, like, where is this thing going to be used? Like, what is this URL? Why am I providing it? Right? So that's kind of this little nudging issue with Passport in practice. Okay, so back inside of our code editor, we're going to add on one more property, which is called callback URL with a capital U, R, and L. And then as a value, we're going to pass a string, and this is going to be the route that the user will be sent to after they grant permissions to our application. So it's going to be /auth/Google/callback. So in a little bit, we are going to add a route handler to our Express application to handle a user coming back to our application on this route right here. We have to add some actual logic that says, oh, hey, this user is coming back from Google right now and they're visiting this URL or this path right here. We need to handle that user appropriately. Okay, so this object is looking good. Now there's one last argument that we're going to provide to the Google strategy. After we close out this object right here, as a second argument, so second argument to the Google strategy, I'm going to pass an arrow function, like so. Now for right now, we're not going to worry too much about this function. I am going to add on a single argument to it. I'm just going to call it access token, and I'm going to console log that value of access token. So let's just ignore this arrow function for right now, and we're just going to leave this console log here and just say, okay, we'll figure out what's going on there a little bit later, okay? So we're just going to leave that for now. Okay, so we're going to save this file. We're going to take a quick break right now, and then when we come back, we're going to be able to test out the first leg of our OAuth flow. So essentially, this first little connection where we send our user over to the Google OAuth servers and then get them redirected back to our application. So let's take care of that inside the next section.